Hello and welcome to Calm the Farm podcast, where pharmacy business meets legal wisdom, minus the headache. In each episode, we share practical legal tips and real-life examples to help you run your pharmacy with confidence. I'm your host, Sarah Stoddart. Thanks very much for joining us. Hello and welcome back. After a few weeks of talking, about non-specific pharmacy and healthcare business related things and talking rather about things outside our business and how that might improve our business, today we're leaping straight back into business components, I suppose. And today I'm talking about leasing and more particularly exercising options on your lease. So it's fairly common for leases to contain an option period. Now those option periods vary. You might have one 3-year option, you might have 3 5-year options. It doesn't really matter. This episode is all about the process. Quite often we have clients coming to us confused about whether there is an option on their lease, and more often talking about when it is they need to exercise their option. Unfortunately, for some of those clients, by the time they come to us, it is too late to exercise the option, and that does create some legal issues, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing to do is be aware of whether or not you actually have an option on your lease. If you do, that's fantastic. It is there to the tenant's advantage to secure tenure, but also provide the ability to stop the lease or end the lease if you don't wish to exercise that option period. So very much in your favour. However, as a tenant, you also have the obligation to make sure it is exercised correctly. Now, the time period in which options need to be exercised vary from lease to lease. For the purposes of today, I'm going to assume that your lease might have something in it which says that you can't exercise your option any earlier than 9 months before the expiry date of your lease and no later than 3 months before the expiry date of your lease. What this means is that you need to know what the expiry date of your lease is and then work out the dates between which you need to exercise the option. So what date is 9 months before the expiry date and what date is 3 months before the expiry date, and exercise your option within that period. For some leases, the period in which to exercise the option is unfortunately not so broad. It might be only a month's gap, or in some circumstances, unfortunately, we actually see it drafted that it is a particular day. So you need to exercise it, for example, 6 months before the expiry date of the lease. So that is, of course, only a 1-day period. So the first thing to do is check whether you have an option period. The second thing to do is to work out the time period in which your option needs to be exercised. The third thing to do is to consider what the rent is going to do if you exercise that option. Again, this should be in your lease, and typically we see a market rent review on the exercise of an option, but sometimes it might just be a fixed percentage review. So it's important to know what your rent is going to do, because you need that information to inform whether or not you're actually going to exercise your option. If you need any help in determining that, by all means get professional advice in that regard. If it is that your lease option, first year of that lease period, is going to be a market rent review, it's worth getting some advice around what the market rent might do. There are protections in the retail leasing legislation regarding market rent. I'm not going to go into that in this episode. However, if you do find it's a market rent review and you have concerns as to what that might be, it is worth getting some advice around those protections. So once you know whether you have an option, when your option has to be exercised, and what your rent is going to do, the next thing to do is ensure that you exercise your option, should you choose to do that, within that time frame. Now, this is an important area because typically people might just send off an email to their landlord saying, "Hi, I want to exercise the option," and they think that's the end of it. However, it is more than not the case that the lease says that notice needs to be given to the landlord. Now, where there is a requirement to actually give notice, that means that the notice needs to be given in accordance with the terms of the lease. Then you need to go to the notices provision in your lease and see what the process is for giving notice. Unfortunately, despite being in 2025, it is unusual to see that notice can be given by email. It is usually the case that notice needs to be given by sending registered post or express post to the landlord. That needs to be done strictly in accordance with the terms of the lease. You might send the letter off to the landlord and also send an email, to cover all bases. However, you must ensure that notice is given in accordance with the terms of the lease. If it isn't, the landlord has a right to say that the option wasn't validly exercised. And if that is the case and notice hasn't been given strictly in compliance with the terms of the lease, unfortunately it means that the landlord does not have to recognise the option period. If that happens, some landlords will of course recognise it, and if you have a strong relationship with your landlord, then fantastic, because hopefully that will be the case. However, for other landlords, particularly if there is an issue with the relationship, or perhaps they have an opportunity to bring a competitor or another business into the premises, then the landlord can actually say no. And that puts you in a situation where you may have to vacate the premises at relatively short notice, or you then go into a bidding war where you are negotiating a new lease and the landlord at that point in time can dictate whatever rent they like. Now, when that situation occurs, it becomes a bit of a bidding war, because your power has gone from being the tenant's power to having the right of the option and having that certainty of tenure, to the landlord holding the power, because essentially the negotiations are such that they can dictate whatever they like, of course within the parameters of the law, and you've got a tenant desperate to stay in the premises. So the action arising out of this episode is to, 1, pull out your lease, check whether you have an option period, then check what time period it needs to be exercised in and diarise those dates. Then looking at your rent provisions, what is your rent going to do if you exercise your option? And then looking at how your option needs to be exercised and how notice is given. As always, if you need a hand, please shout out. I'm happy to do this. Also happy to assist with drafting that notice to the landlord to make sure it is done strictly. But this is something that we do see commonly done incorrectly. It's important to be across it to protect your business and to ensure you don't have any headaches when it comes time to your lease ending, which may, in the worst case scenario, require you to vacate the premises or look for alternative premises on relatively short notice. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon.